Well, live from Jerusalem, it's Saturday Delight. Actually, not too many people are going to get that joke. This Shabbat, March 28, 2020, we have two back-to-back stories that involve healings on the Sabbath. And they're mentioned in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. That's two for the price of three. Today, the bulk of our focus is on Luke's version, and that will be from chapter 6, starting in verse 1 through 11. There may be a few references here and there that we'll make with Matthew, chapter 12, 1 through 8, or Mark, chapter 2, 23 through 28. And if you're using a synopsis such as Kurt Allen's, that's number 46, and also number 111. We're all in quarantine, as you know, and we're kind of cooped up here, feeling almost a bit strangulated, withered. It would be nice to stretch out and take a long walk, but there are restrictions, no more than 100 meters, so I guess there's rules for Shabbat, rules for quarantine. Let's get started with the reading, and before we do, I think I'm going to add a little more pizzazz to the whole scene here. Since we're cooped up at home, it would be nice to have like a different background, something with meaning, something that would connect to our stories. So I thought it would be nice to have maybe a wheat field up north somewhere, maybe by Mount Tabor. All right, so here's the reading. This is Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 1, and I'm just going to go all the way through verse 11. Now it happened on the second Sabbath, after the first, that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But Jesus answered them, "Have you not heard this? What David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how they went into the house of God, or how he went into the house of God, took and ate the bread of the presence, lechem hapanim, and also gave some of those with him, he gave them some bread, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Now it happened on another Sabbath also, that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an occasion to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he rose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy?" And when he had looked around at all of them, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So we have some initial questions. Does Jesus, or do his students, his disciples, break a Sabbath commandment in either of these two stories? And are there different rabbinic or Pharisaic views about what is allowed, Halakhah, in regards to rubbing the grain on the Sabbath? As many of you know, the regulars know, this is the Narkis St Bible Study, and we have different presenters, different teachers. I'm not really one of the scholars in the group. I'm just one of the very interested students. And my opinions today may not reflect the opinions of Narkis St as a whole, but one of the things we like to do is to make sure that we use a standard approach when we study the Synoptic Gospels, that they must be read in a Jewish context to be understood within the context of Second Temple period Judaism, and also the halachic outlook. Halakhah is simply walking. How do we walk out? How are rules understood? Do we need to make adjustments, and so forth? We also look at the vocabulary and style of the texts And it should also be said that the original Jewish outlines and traditions from which these gospel stories have formed have become somewhat blurred in a lot of Christian or Western teachings. So we try to get to the root, we try to get to the source, and to do that we are definitely studying Second Temple period Jewish history and language and literature and culture. Perhaps one of the most important points in this original language quest is this source that we call Q. That source material was probably in Hebrew, which has been proven time and time again by a number of scholars, especially those of the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Gospel Research, David Bivin, of course, the late Bob Lindsay, the late David Flusser, all the other founding members that are still with us. We have Steve Notley, Randall Booth, Halvar Ronning, Brad Young, and many others. I'm also going to be quoting here from one of the founding members, the late Shmuel Safrai, and his daughter Hannah was also instrumental in giving me a lot of direction along with Steve Notley. So what we're going to do, with all this in mind, we're going to try to penetrate more deeply into the biblical text, and we need to kind of establish the playing field. So there are different authoritative groups or clusters of Greek texts from which to draw on this story. And many of you may know that the King James draws on a collection of texts, the Textus Receptus, which is part of the majority texts, which are mostly medieval in their dating. And this is the backbone of the King James Version. So in this particular reading, the one I'm using, it retains the curious word Sabbato deuteroproto. The late scholar, Shmuel Safrai, particularly liked this reading, even though he understood that it was from a late collection of Greek manuscripts. In other words, these the Textus Receptus, the medieval period collection. But I looked at it and found that it actually does appear, this particular reading, in several older manuscripts, including a 5th century text called Alexandrinus, and this is quite significant. It's also in Codex Bezae. So I'm just going to go ahead and put the Greek text up on the screen, if I can, to show, to highlight the deuteroproto. So the Sabbath that basically comes second after the first. So he goes through a field on this particular Sabbath, and the reason Shmuel Safrai liked this so much is because he believed it gave a hint as to not only the time of year, which we know is springtime, there's wheat harvest, but very specific time in what we call the counting of the Omer. The Omer. His article was published in the Jerusalem Perspective back in 1990. As a matter of fact, August of 1990. There he is. And it's interesting for me personally. I remember when this issue first came out. It was also the first month that I was sort of initiated into biblical study tourism because of Steve Notley. He got me involved in Christchurch study tours, a company called Gerrish. And I remember when this article came out, and as a matter of fact, I felt like it was a real helpful insight, and it is a very helpful insight into this story. And he took this, what would be considered sort of an awkward way to say something, this deuteroproto, or second first. He took this and applied it to the time of the counting of the Omer, which begins at Passover, a couple days after Passover. There are certain groups of certain Jewish communities that started after the first Shabbat after Passover. And as you probably know, it goes on for 7 weeks. And it involves everyone. As a matter of fact, the primary text for this concept comes out of Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15. And it's not just something that the priests did at the temple, this daily wave offering. It was something that everybody was involved in. Everybody across the country is aware of this particular counting, this countdown towards the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. And what we know from this story is that Jesus' students are plucking grain, the heads of grain, and they're rubbing it with their hands. It's harvest season. So here's some interesting thoughts about the harvest season. In the harvest season, if a person lived in higher elevations, such as where we are in Jerusalem, the season may not start quite on time. As a matter of fact, they brought some of the barley in to the temple, and if it was still green, they would kind of smoke it first. But down in the lower altitudes, the lower elevations, like say up at the Jezreel, the Sea of Galilee, even lower, subtropical area, the crops could be coming in maybe a couple weeks earlier than someplace like Jerusalem. So I can imagine that if you're walking through fields that are about to be harvested or have been harvested, you haven't had grain maybe for a while, you're anticipating this harvest, it would almost be mouth-watering. As a matter of fact, I'm not a farmer. My father and grandfather and great-grandfather were all farmers, so I don't have a lot of experience with this, but I am keenly aware of certain crops when they're about to come in, the corn, the milo, different grains, rice, and so forth. I was around a number of farms as a young person. But here in this country, there's something that's almost irresistible to me, and that is right before the figs are ready for harvest, you walk through the woods, if it's a wild fig or if it's a cultivated area, the aroma of the ripening figs is almost irresistible. And I would say if you're walking through a grain field, hungry or not, it would almost be irresistible to not rub some grains and get some of that flavor in your mouth. So I would say it's almost overwhelming. We deal with this subject of Halakhah, which literally has to do with walking, how you walk out or how you behave, the guidance in Torah, God's teaching, and establishing or fine-tuning what is allowed or not allowed. An example of this would be, for example, that in the Torah, people were commanded to circumcise their sons, newborn sons, on the 8th day. And that's a covenantal commandment. It's huge. But what the Torah doesn't describe is what if the 8th day lands on a Shabbat? Do you go ahead and do the circumcision and break the Shabbat because there's cutting involved? It's an actual bit of work. It's messy. You might also want to boil some water and start a fire, boil water, clean your utensils and things. So there would be certain things that wouldn't quite work on a Shabbat. But the answer wasn't given in Torah. So what do you do? Do you go ahead and circumcise or not? And so the ruling parties in Jesus' time probably included priests, Pharisaical groups. It could have been a Sanhedrin, almost kind of collection of argument until they came to a conclusion. But they decided it's better to keep circumcision even if it falls on a Shabbat, on the 8th day, because that's covenant. Shabbat, God will have to just deal with it. If it's breaking a Shabbat command, so be it. So establishing halakha, when it comes to grain, plucking, harvesting, rubbing it with your hands, whether you're allowed to put a sickle to it or not. So the main verse is Deuteronomy 23:25, which basically says, you may pluck heads of grain with your hands, but you may not put a sickle to the standing grain. Okay, that's understandable, especially if it's not your property. Everybody knows you can walk through somebody else's, farm and see their vineyards, and maybe the grapes are ready. And according to Torah, you're supposed to be able to pick and eat, but you can't collect. You can't bring a basket with you and collect somebody else's produce, but you can eat your way through. Well, that really is quite a nice, welcoming sort of thing to know. But you would also know that a lot of farms are smaller, in this region especially. There's a lot of very small farms, terrace farms on the hillsides. To walk through and eat somebody else's crops, it wouldn't take long until that would absolutely ruin, that would devastate some neighbor's crop. So there was Halakhah, there was an understanding that, you don't just do that. Maybe leave the corners for the poor, that they can come and glean, and what has fallen after gleaning, then you can walk through and eat some of that. So if it's after the harvest, that was the understanding, the Jewish understanding at the time, that you could enter somebody else's vineyard or wheat field, barley, and eat as much as you want, but only after harvest, and actually even again after the poor have already had their turn. So this was sort of the general understanding. But what about Shabbat? Can you do this on a Shabbat? Can you pluck? Now, I'm not talking about using a sickle, but can you just pluck from a wheat field on Shabbat? And there is a prohibition. It's in Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. Basically prohibiting things like that on Shabbat. So now we have a dilemma. So there's a prohibition of harvesting and threshing on Shabbat, Exodus 34, verse 21. So we do have a dilemma about harvesting grain on Shabbat. But that verse basically is talking about using utensils, like a sickle. So according to some rabbinic opinions during the Talmudic period, which is a little bit after Jesus, the idea of rubbing hands together with grain was considered breaking Shabbat, the laws for Shabbat. However, one rabbi, his name was Yehuda, he said the rubbing of the hands with the grain, as long as no other utensils were used, that should be fine. One rabbi from the same period also proposed that it was okay to rub the grain with the fingers. That should be okay. The idea of plucking suddenly becomes kind of an odd detail. David Flusser, the late David Flusser, who was a close friend and colleague of Bob Lindsay, he pointed out this detail that plucking is quite odd, and that there are some Greek texts where the word plucking is actually missing. He says if there really was plucking, which is a type of harvesting with the hands, then we might have a legitimate case for law breaking. But as long as there's no plucking, there's no law breaking. Rubbing the grains in the hand is not such a bad deal. I'll leave that because I'm not the expert on Greek manuscripts and witnesses, which ones has plucking, which ones do not. I will say this though, on Shabbat, there are things that happen, practical things that happen that need to happen, such as preparing meals and certain kitchen details. I'm not talking about kindling up a fire and baking something, making stew, but perhaps the coals were kept hot from the previous day so that you can keep a meal warm throughout the Shabbat. You're still going to have to collect dishes and put them in the sink. And there's a few mundane things that would still take place. The same at the temple in Jerusalem. It's in some ways it's a regular day in terms of the daily sacrifice. So even at the temple, the priests were offering up a daily sacrifice. That means killing an animal. There's cutting involved and offering that animal on the fire. Of course, it's a fire that's been lit from the previous day or days. But life continues. It's something that everybody knows. There's some elements of life that just go on. They continue on the Shabbat. Going back to the main story for just a moment, we know that the barley harvest is coming in at Passover. It's just beginning. And 50 days later, we really are in the heart of the wheat harvest. So I thought I would also throw up a photo of the difference between barley and wheat for the most part. And barley in this country is sown in the midwinter before the heavy rains come. And so it's the first grain crop that's coming in, say in March, April. In other places around the world, there's a type of wheat, it's winter wheat, that they plant that in the winter, and then barley could be a bit later. So it's a little bit different in this country. So we have barley harvest first, and then the wheat harvest. And now to the curious link in all of these synoptic stories, all three synoptic versions of this story have this same element. This is a link to King David. So it's another understanding, it's another key to understanding this difficult passage and its synoptic parallels. The text doesn't really provide a clear picture of all the details from a halachic point of view, in other words, how they work out the rules. It just says his disciples were hungry. That's a vital fact, but that only appears in Matthew. It doesn't mention that the disciples were hungry in Luke or Mark. So if Jesus' disciples profaned the Sabbath, as it might seem at first glance, it was because they were starving, or was it? That's the way it would seem by verse 3. For the fact that David was hungry, Jesus says, which appears in all three synoptic accounts, it's part of Jesus' argument. It's not mentioned at all in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament version of this episode. So if you're reading 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 6, you have this story of David going to the priests at a place called Nob, and he basically is looking for supplies for his men and for himself. And there is no reference of him being hungry or that his men were hungry. It's just assumed. And he's looking for supplies, so they don't have regular bread, so they give him the bread of the presence, lechem hapanim, which of course Martin Luther translated as showbread, as H-E-W, but these days not too many people understand what that word means. It's kind of fallen off. So bread of the presence is a much nicer way to talk about that special bread in the temple that is really only for priests. David's action is how Jesus explains and justifies the action of his disciples. Looking for supplies, bread, assuming that they're hungry. And if you look at some of the rabbinic commentaries about this story in 1 Samuel, several rabbis talk about how they were overcome with overwhelming hunger and acted to save their lives on the principle of pikuach nefesh, which has to do with saving a life. If saving a life means you break, say, a Sabbath law, it's more important to save the life. Pikuach nefesh. It's permissible to violate any commandment if necessary in order to preserve life. The Jerusalem Talmud contains the following statement by Rabbi Huna. David ate those 24 Isserons on account of his hunger. It's in a tractate called Yoma. And Rav Huna also speaks of the big hunger because it's clear that according to him and his opinion, that David's men were really overwhelmed with hunger. And in this case, Jesus is sort of making a throwback. He's making a connection to David. David was hungry. His men were hungry. This is pikuach nefesh. You got to feed them. You got to save a life. All other rules are set aside for this moment. So is Jesus appealing to David to sort of define his authority as the royal son of God, anticipated since the days of King David? Could very well be. It's interesting, though, that Luke's account, the emphasis is not necessarily one of hunger, but there is a general trend in the Gospels that you could say that there's sort of an authorization of performance of certain labors on Shabbat. Maybe that's the case. David and his men were not condemned for eating the bread of the presence. Neither should Jesus' disciples be condemned. That could be the takeaway for that particular subject. And now we come to the subject of the Son of Man. The Son of Man. Bar Anosh, the Aramaic from Daniel 7, or Ben Adam, the Hebrew, literally son of Adam. Is Son of Man another term for just man, or something more divine? This is not really the session to fully unravel or provide the most accurate interpretation of this well-known but complicated expression. It has a certain range of meaning. As David Flusser put it, the Son of Man could be sort of a cosmic judge. You can read about some of that in his book on Jesus, also some of his other articles. In fact, this particular article on Son of Man in this book is quite compelling, and he lays out a number of different sort of functions of the expression and the role that Jesus may be highlighting. So he could be a cosmic judge or a man-like judge at the end of times, especially if you are tuned into the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumranic literature. The end of times is really quite a focus. Or the one true prophet, which some early Jewish believers, like the Ebionites, they sort of maintained the Son of Man would be an end times prophet. According to Flusser, you've probably all read this, but he believed Jesus had a very, very high sense of awareness about his task here on earth. And he clearly saw himself as a prophet, to be as a prophet, and to be sort of the eschatological Son of Man in terms of like a supreme judge, someone who will witness against his generation, especially if there's cruelty or mishandling of God's word. Then a prophet, like prophets of old, would be sent to a king to straighten out some immoral behavior or point attention to something like that, such as Nathan did with King David. That he would point out flaws in religious behavior of the leadership of his day. But according to Flusser, he doesn't think Jesus saw himself as a prophet of the last days necessarily, but more pertinently to just be in his generation, to wherever that is. If it's the end of days, I guess that's fine too, but wherever he's at in time, that he would be like a prophet to point out inconsistencies, to clear up evil leadership. But he also Jesus understood the expression Ben Adam or Bar Anosh, especially Ben Adam, as something that like Abel, who was literally Ben Adam, son of Adam, that Abel was killed by his brother. So when Jesus uses the term Son of Man, sometimes it's in the context of, yes, the Son of Man has to die. And just like we would assume he's referring to Abel or something greater. A lot of scholars, and these would be mostly Western scholars that we would have, say, in the Christian world, they like to point out the definite article used with Son of Man, the Son of Man, or the Son of Man. Jesus' unique vocation of the Son of Man with divine authority and power. So many scholars do not agree that Son of Man means a mere man. They often use verses like Luke chapter 5, verse 24, as a case in point, because Jesus said that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins. This basic understanding is that no one but God can do this. If you're listening to the criticisms from Pharisees, for example, no one but God can forgive sins unless we're speaking about a trespass between neighbors. The idea of saying, I'm sorry, should require the response, I forgive you. Not sure how that fits in so well with this particular story, but Flusser is definitely, and many others, especially in the Jerusalem school, are convinced that Ben Adam is many times just a reference to people, a man, a person. So now we focus on the second story from Luke chapter 6 that involves a healing on a Sabbath. And it's in particular about a man with a withered hand, his right hand in particular. According to teachings in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 21, verse 17, you get this word to Aaron, saying that no man of your offspring throughout their generations who has a defect shall approach to offer the bread to his God, for no one who has a defect shall approach, a blind man or a lame man, or one who has a disfigured face, or any deformed limb. Okay. This subject, deformities, is something of key interest to me. What were these prohibitions? How did people understand the prohibitions? And we get a very, very extreme view in Jesus' day from the community at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll community, the Essenes, the people who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had a very, very strict view on this. So I'm quoting from 11QTA. It's chapter 45, verses 12 through 14. So one of the Qumran scrolls from Cave 11. No blind person shall enter in all their days, and they shall not defile the city in whose midst I dwell, because I, God, dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever and always. So when they highlight this word city, they're talking about Jerusalem. Also from Cave 11, another scroll mentions that the blind, they are potential polluters of Jerusalem. They must be excluded from the holy city. And it sort of combines several texts together from Numbers and Isaiah and Samuel. And they come to a conclusion that anybody who has a blemish, a deformity, blindness, they're to be excluded from the congregation of the men of renown. There's another one from Cave 1QSA. The blind and the lame, among others with the bodily imperfections or impurities, may not present themselves in the congregation. In other words, not even joining like a synagogue service. One more from Qumran. Well, two more. 1QM, chapter 7. No one with physical defects may participate in the final eschatological battle against evil. And 1QSA, no lame, blind, or crippled will be allowed to attend the messianic banquet. And so with this story in Luke, instantly I was relieved and pleased to see that this man with a withered hand is mixing with the assembly. He's in the synagogue and he's allowed, he's welcome. In other words, the Pharisees and the religious authorities in sort of the mainstream of Judaism, not Qumran sectarians, but mainstream, they're okay with someone being in the assembly with an imperfection. That's very satisfying to know. I'm quoting a little bit from someone named Menachem Kister. He is going to draw attention to this element, the withered hand, the Sabbath, and he's going to draw attention to pikuach nefesh, setting aside everything to save a soul, to rescue someone. So he's not saying that there's necessarily a danger to the man's life or despair, but Jesus heals a man with a withered hand, though without really violating the Sabbath. He prefaces his action with a question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to harm, to save life or to destroy it? The concept by the words to save life, suchein sosai, is practically synonymous with pikuach nefesh. So I'm not sure if Kister was the first person to notice this, but it's one of the first articles I ever read years ago where somebody highlighted this in the text. So suchein sosai, the two Greek words there, are basically the same meaning, synonymous with pikuach nefesh. So, is it permissible to do good in general on the Sabbath? It seems like Halakhah hadn't caught up with the times. And I think one element in this story is that Jesus is trying to catch people up. If you've allowed, for example, circumcision on the Sabbath, well, John chapter 7, go ahead and allow healings on the Sabbath. Go ahead and adjust your halakhah a little bit. So it should be lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Kister also points out that the term suchein sosai is perhaps a translation of the rare rabbinic expression kiyum nefesh, which is basically synonymous with pikuach nefesh. That the original Hebrew behind these stories, the sort of, we call it the Q source, that Luke may be drawing from, Mark, Matthew, that this original source was in Hebrew, and when it's translated into Greek or reconstructed into Greek, you can see it. You can see this idea, kiyum nefesh or pikuach nefesh. And he thought that Luke's account should even be reconstructed to say lekayem nefesh le'abeda, to establish a life, to save a life, restore a life is probably even better. And he quotes a couple of examples in the Mishnah, a tractate called Sanhedrin, which speaks about preserving life, mekayem nefesh, instead of destroying life, me'abed nefesh. In other words, it is a known concept in Judaism from that period, the value of saving a life or preserving a life. Kister also said this: how do we know that the necessity of saving a life, pikuach nefesh, supersedes the Sabbath? And this may be explained using the principle kal v'chomer. If the Sabbath must be abrogated for the sake of one limb, it is only right that it should be abrogated for the sake of the whole man. In other words, common sense should reign here. In summary, or in conclusion, I think I would tell a short story. Most of you know that I'm a tour guide, and I've been working for the past 30 years with tour groups, students, church groups, all types of people. And I've seen all kinds of interesting things. I've even witnessed something that might apply to this story. We had a group, they were at the Jordan River. It was during the cooler months of the year. There was a woman being baptized in some other group, and my group was standing on the shore and they were watching this other group, and they noticed that, well, first of all, it was cold. The water was cold. It was winter time or early spring. The water was quite cold. And they all noticed that this one woman who was being dunked, her head didn't go all the way under. As a matter of fact, her face wasn't even wet when she came up. And you sort of felt some rumblings in the community that I was standing with. Oh, well, she didn't go all the way under. Is it legitimate? And, it was done in a playful way, but you could tell that some people were a little bit disturbed. There was a conservative element, and that they were uncomfortable that she didn't get all the way under. She wasn't fully immersed. And I think I would apply that to this story, that there are some of the Pharisees in this story. For example, the first phase of the story, the wheat fields and the rubbing grains. There were some Pharisees, perhaps not all Pharisees, but there were some that were a little disturbed by that. That seems like breaking a Sabbath boundary. That seems like breaking a law. There are rules in place that help to save lives. There are rules for this particular quarantine season that we're going through. For example, now we're not allowed to walk more than 100 meters from our houses. We have a trampoline in our yard, and there are rules for that trampoline, just like there are rules for swimming pools. These rules are designed to preserve life. These things are enjoyable. A trampoline's a lot of fun. A swimming pool is great fun, but there's rules. Otherwise, somebody could get hurt. You could have an accident. Someone could drown. There are rules in place. So I think one possible takeaway for this story, or both of these Sabbath stories, is that everyone, including a person with a withered hand, should be able to rub some grain in their hands and eat some grain on a Sabbath. Why? Because it should be an enjoyable day for the people. God made Shabbat, a day of rest for the people. Sabbath delight, oneg Shabbat. Oneg means delight, delightful. This is the expression we use today in Hebrew. Some of you also may know that Sharon Alley uses oneg Shabbat, Sabbath delight, because it's the one day out of the week that she allows herself to enjoy a cup of coffee. Shabbat should be something that we delight in, really enjoy. My prayer is that the Lord of the Sabbath will grant us a healing, even that we might stretch out our withered conditions so that we can enjoy the Shabbat, even during this time of virus and anxiety, that our withered lives would be restored as new. Oneg Shabbat Shalom.